Hello and welcome to another Total Education Media lecture. Tonight I'm going to talk about another one of Alistair MacLeod's short stories from his collection Island. And this short story is The Lost Salt Gift of Blood. This story is a very intense story and very emotional story, and it links to family, it links to the world, it links to the community, and it links in all sorts of very subtle ways. And the relationship between the narrator, the father who comes back to see his son, and the grandparents and the son, and the interrelationship between those four people is extremely subtle and complex. And I think MacLeod does a brilliant job in showing that. In saying that, the story is conveyed in a melancholic way. And it's like most of MacLeod's stories in that it has a tinge of sadness through it. And that goes right through all the characters in many ways. And it's also a story about loss, but not this time necessarily loss as in death, although there is death in it, of course, but loss of innocence. And I made my notes here that says the loss is not just death, but places as well, and innocence. The harbour and the sea play a vital role in this, as they do in all of MacLeod's stories, basically based in Newfoundland. But I think in this one, he shows the harbour right at the very start of the story as a link to the outside world. And I think that link's very important. And the harbour, he says, is a link to the world, but it's also, he claims, a peaceful and nurturing and those sorts of words as well. So it's a safe haven in many ways, but it's also an outlet. And he says at the start of the story, this outlet to the world is like this. Even farther out, somewhere beyond Cape Spear, lies Dublin and the Irish coast. Far away, but still the nearest land. And closer now than is Toronto or Detroit, to say nothing of North America's more western cities, seemingly almost hazily visible now in imagination's mist. And he talks very clearly about the distance he is from his place of work now and where he lives. And he lives in the Midwest, and it's a very, very different world. He's journeyed over 2,500 miles, an extremely long way, and as we find out later, has several flights, and it's very difficult for him to get to the island. He's got a rental car, and it's a big journey, so we know it must be an important and purposeful journey, yet MacLeod, in his way, doesn't tell us right from the start. We need to investigate and explore the story to find out all the detail that goes on. And I think that's one of the techniques he uses, that sort of sense of mystery and in almost many ways the reader becomes a detective as you work your way through the story, picking up little bits and little facts and little tidbits of information until it's all revealed close to the end. And he has come a long way, our narrator, and he's coming back to the island and he's integrating himself back into the island very slowly, and it doesn't seem to work. He doesn't fit here anymore. Look at the attempts he makes at fishing with his casting, and we see that those attempts are basic failures, and he hasn't been very successful in integrating, but he does enjoy the camaraderie with the boys. And we find out later one of these boys is his son, and it's not revealed at that particular moment in time, and he's just sort of being absorbed back into the land and the world that is Newfoundland and the Cape Breton Islands and all those sorts of places that he talks about. And this small island it seems very insular, but it's a community, and we see that people are quite happy there and set in their ways. And the world hasn't really affected the grandparents, but I'll talk about them a little bit more later. As I said, he's lost that connection because he's in the Midwest, and I think the quote that sums it up is he says, "Perhaps no place for me at all." And he says that about the island when he's back. He knows John, his son, is there, but he never reveals it. And the old man knows when he meets him, he says, "How have you been?" But he's very withdrawn. And I think one of the key elements of this story that you should talk about is the idea of the sense of community and localness and how tight that is. And the language, again, is very clipped and short, and there's no stories. And the anecdotes we get and a lot of the information is conveyed in different ways, and it's not necessarily through conversation. And I think that's a very important point. You need to talk about that as one of the techniques that makes this story just a little bit different from some of the other ones. I think it's important that we find out that the relationship between the grandfather and a narrator is very cagey, and they're both feeling themselves out and sort of setting up a scene. We don't quite know what they're on about. The description of the house indicates a simple, non-materialistic lifestyle, and I think that's extremely important. And McLeod sets up the way the grandparents live in that very simple, non-materialistic, almost quaint, old-fashioned way, but with touches of modernness in many ways, but not a modernity that's affected them in any way. They're certainly not consumers as we know them, and people, the city people, and in the Midwest that we come to meet later on in that famous last paragraph. I think also that the lovely paragraph on page 128 of seeing the narrator for the first time, the grandmother, and I'm going to read that paragraph because I think that's one of the highlights of this short story. And certainly McLeod writes, and we've talked about the description that he uses, but I think this interaction between two characters is one of the better pieces of writing in this short story. Her eyes contain only mild surprise as she first regards me. Then, with recognition, they glow in open hostility, which in turn subsides and yields to self-control. She continues at the stove, while the rest of us sit upon the chairs. And it's just that very, very short paragraph with that subtle interaction of the grandmother who knows that the father might have come to take his son away, and she doesn't really know how to respond and how to react. And it's a very human and natural reaction. And only the author, or the narrator in this case, would pick it up. And it's meant for him and all those different changes he notices. And he's a good observer and acute observer. And we also need to remember that when we look at this story, that his acute observations are forming part of this. And he conveys a lot of emotion through those acute observations. And McLeod, again, he shows us, he doesn't tell us in many ways, and it's an important technique in story writing, as you know from studying of extension. The boy is an interesting character in the fact that he's lived in the city and he lived in Toronto with his mother for a while, but didn't quite like it. He seems to prefer the island, and we get the idea that he's become accustomed to living on the island. It's a preferential lifestyle for him. And he does go, as I said, live with his mother, and he's returning anyway when she's killed. So it doesn't really make a lot of difference to his life. And I think that's one thing that impacts on the father and stops him from taking the boy. And John says, "When I was in Toronto," says John, "no one was ever up before 7. I would make my own tea and wait. It was wonderful sad. There were gulls there, though, flying over Toronto Harbour. We went to see them on 2 Sundays. And I think that's an important paragraph in the characterisation of John, that he enjoys where he is, he likes where he is, and the mention of the seagulls and going to see them on 2 Sundays has stayed with him. And it's not the sort of thing that most kids necessarily would remember. Most kids remember more exciting things they did, like visits to, I don't know, Disneyland or places that normally would like. But John's a simpler sort of soul, and he fits in much better on the island. And I think McLeod conveys that in that paragraph in a very, very nice way. We should probably talk about the other techniques that he uses in this and how the information is conveyed. And we need to think, as we comment on this story, the use of the songs. And of course the songs present a certain mood, a sense of loss, and they're relevant in that way that they build upon the emotion of the story and they reflect how people feel about places and relationships. And I think you need to talk about how McLeod integrates those and why he would include those, because they are forming a strong part of the story, and they occupy a space in the story where it's brought about by, a feeling of there's nothing to do, how are we going to move the evening along? And I think they're one of the ways that it's done. What else is there? We know that the mother's killed in the car accident, and the grandfather says to the boy, we haven't had sons of our own. And I think it's the idea of the sons is really important. And he's the last link in the family, and all the daughters have moved away. And I think that's another good link you can use to talk about the global and the relationship that these people have with the outside world, that like in all the stories that McLeod writes, the sons and the daughters tend to move away off the island. And you could link that to each of the stories, how the children develop and grow up and move on. And I think the grandfather sums it up very clearly. He says, "We be all alone," he says, "all our daughters married and far away in Montreal, Toronto or the States. Hard for them to come back here, even to visit. They comes only every 3 years or so for perhaps a week. So we be having only him." And I think that that's significant in the fact that it sums up the reaction of young people to the island. And John seems to be a little bit different at this stage in his life and his development. And it gives the grandparents something to cling to of their family and the past. And in many ways, you can nearly say it's a little bit selfish of them, although I don't think it is necessarily so. It could certainly be interpreted that way. You might also talk about some of the literary allusions when you're talking about MacLeod. And in this story, he makes, of course, that very direct reference to Wuthering Heights and Cathy and Heathcliff. And you've studied that story, I would imagine, and read it at some point. And the author feels, although he's got his son in the house, he feels like an outsider, as Lockwood was in Wuthering Heights. And that allusion with the ghosts and the memories and the family and all the stories that are inherent with that build another layer to this story. So that's very important. And we need to remember also in this that the narrator's dilemma is extremely important. It's the core of the story and the purpose of the story and the purpose of the visit. His dilemma is, does he take the child back to the Midwest or does he leave the child? And I think those things are very, very important. And you need to think about the reasons why he might take him and the reasons why he might leave him. I think it's in itself a very awkward leaving. There's a contrast between, he doesn't even say to his son, "You're my son," or any of those sorts of things. And I think John's basically become a token or a memento in the man's life when he gives him the rock, because it doesn't give you the impression that he's ever going to see him again. And I think the grandparents are going to bring the child up. And the father, seemingly without saying anything and just thinking about it from the previous night, has given up his rights to the child in many ways. And that he feels that John's life would be better on the island, certainly would be in the Midwest. And MacLeod reinforces this in that awkward leaving stage with the stone and how he develops and gives him those sorts of little touches that are sweet. Some of the other techniques, I already talked about the mystery element to the story and the circumstances, how they're slowly revealed and we don't get that sort of conclusion or denouement to the end. We also need to think about the contrast between the different worlds that the man inhabits, and I'd direct you to that last paragraph. I won't have time to read it now, but I'd certainly like to direct you to that, and the materialism that's inherent in that, and the complete contrast between the children of the salesman and John. Let's think about the choice between the local and the global and why those choices are made and linked to the other stories in Ireland. John revels in simplicity. He makes the checkers. He does simple things. He collects rocks. He likes going fishing. He lives that sort of simple life that seems to be gone from a lot of children. Although he loves the local, he knows it's not perfect, as do the grandparents and the father, but it seems suitable for John. And John has seen both, and as I said before, he chooses. It's really a choice between a simple and a complicated life, I suppose, and that's how the world's seen in this. I've talked before in this series of talks about the short sentences and the clipped conversations based on very simplistic words but conveying huge amounts of emotion, and I think that's extremely important. Again, in this story, we have the use of anecdotes, recollections, songs. And I think the newspaper article and all those sorts of things all build that narrative. And the idea of the tattered clipping with the death of their daughter, that's really all that's left of her. And I think that's important, and we need to remember that the idea of the journey is important in all these stories. People tend to move away from the islands and Cape Breton and all those sorts of places and go out into the world and come back. And this time someone's come back, and much as in The Road to Rankin's Point, the person's come back to the island and doesn't really get what they want or what they need and go away, and they feel a little bit hollow, and there's that sense of torn between the two ideas. Well, that's really all we have time for and discussing the Lost Salt Gift of Blood. I hope you've enjoyed that. Don't forget to visit the Total Education Centre website. You can also press the like button down there. Go and visit our Facebook page. There's some special offers there and some news and information that will help you with your studies. But mainly don't forget, these are only very short talks, and the website has more detailed notes, and certainly the Here to Succeed lecture series will help you develop and build on these ideas and give you a complete and complex understanding. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye now.